Mikie Sherrill is a freshman representative from New Jersey's 11th Congressional District. Happens to be the district that I grew up in, so I was always keenly aware that that district had been controlled by Republicans since before I was born. And Mikie Sherrill in 2018 won it by a fairly shocking margin, more than 10 points, which was a major partisan shift in that particular area. And the 11th Congressional District of New Jersey was actually the single greatest partisan shift anywhere in the country in the 2018 midterm elections. So Cheryl is actually a somewhat interesting figure, partially because she's more emblematic of the Democratic caucus than people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, the small handful of freshman representatives that get an incredibly outsized portion of the media coverage. If the media actually wanted to gauge the median of the new Democratic caucus, not so new anymore, but the one that came into power this year, they'd focus more on people like Cheryl, who was recruited studiously by the DCCC, had all the right professional credentials, was formerly a federal prosecutor, etc. So I happened to be in the area today, and I went to a town hall that she held in Verona, New Jersey. And there was one moment in particular that stood out to me. For the most part, the questions that came up were what you'd expect: healthcare, the tax bill, various miscellaneous things related to Trump. But there was a moment when she was asked a reasonably intelligent question about campaign finance reform, because as the woman who asked the question, I think, correctly noted, a lot of the policy reforms that Democrats in particular would like to see enacted are made almost impossible by the current structure of the electoral system, which prioritizes taking in huge amounts of money from wealthy donors. And those donors, therefore, dictate the congressional and legislative and even presidential agenda. So Cheryl responded to that question in a somewhat boilerplate fashion. Remember, she's trying to have the appearances of moderation because although she won in 2018 by a somewhat shocking margin, it was 14 points, there could easily be a flip back to the Republicans next cycle. So she doesn't want to get too ahead of herself. And in response to this question, she was just saying how she's in favor of kind of the generic Democratic initiatives to bring transparency to political spending and that kind of thing. And I just want to play you a little soundbite here of what occurred. So through my magical editing skills, you will now hear that soundbite.
I'll tell you, I jokingly say what your money buys you for me is a phone call to say I'm going to vote against you, and here's why, which I made quite a few of those phone calls, so nobody's bought my vote. But there is something wrong when we don't know who's funding our election system, when we don't know where the money's coming from. I'm sorry? Russia. We can, I think they got my phone, so we can talk about that too. But it's really critical that we, and
Okay, so as you can tell, when Mikie Sherrill was responding to a question about how one might address the influence of money in politics, somebody in the crowd yells out Russia, as if Russia is surreptitiously funding the entire American electoral process. I mean, even if you have the most maximalist view of, quote, Russian interference, the idea that Russia is really pulling the strings in every congressional, Senate, presidential election, etc., I mean, that's a little out there. And you might have also heard somebody in the crowd yell out Moscow Mitch, which has become one of the favorite nicknames for Mitch McConnell to imply that he's compromised by Russia. I mean, how ridiculous is that? I'm far from a fan of Mitch McConnell, but it seems like the dumbest possible criticism of him that you might level is that he's compromised by Russia. No. He's compromised, if anything, by the moneyed interests that have supported him over the course of his career and whose ideology he aligns with. It's really not that complicated, but these people seem to overcomplicate things by infusing their entire narrative of how American politics currently operates with some kind of nefarious Russian influence. Of course, it's nothing new, but I do think it's occasionally worth reflecting on the fact that this brain rot is so widespread within huge swaths of the electorate, especially the kinds of parts of the electorate that would attend a town hall meeting on a otherwise peaceful summer evening. These are the people you can pretty well ascertain who watch MSNBC all day and basically devise their entire political worldview around whatever's on the agenda on MSNBC. And you can tell that by talking to the people there and hearing the points that they raise. And some of them even, complimented Cheryl on her MSNBC appearances. So it's not like it's a big secret. But, as somebody who has covered the Russian interference narrative from the outset, we're now at a phase where you're not getting like bombshell revelations every other week, but you're kind of dealing with the after effects of the ways in which that narrative has really warped the mindset of a lot of people who are highly engaged with the electoral process. And it's going to stay with us for a long time because these people are still very agitated about what they see as a lack of action and counteracting Russian influence. There were also people there who were demanding impeachment. There has been an activist push on the part of groups like Indivisible and others to send people to come to these meetings, Democrat and Republican, and demand action on impeachment. Cheryl has not overtly endorsed impeachment proceedings, partly because she likely views it as a risk given that she represents a district that has historically been Republican-leaning. If you know anything about this district, it's full of very affluent suburbs in the New York City metropolitan area. So getting on board the impeachment train, I think Cheryl perceives as a liability, with good reason, perhaps. So she didn't confirm her support of impeachment proceedings, unlike more than half of the Democratic caucus now. So she's actually in the minority in the caucus. But she vaguely endorsed what Gerald Nadler's doing and said, we need more evidence. And you could tell that the impeachment-focused members of the crowd were not satisfied with that answer and were, in fact, very frustrated. So we're in a bit of a downtime with this narrative now, but it's going to heat up again probably in October or so when Nadler's committee decides whether to refer articles of impeachment to the full House, and that's going to be a mess. Either way, when you're at an event like this and Russia comes up and it kind of distorts ordinary people's understandings of issues that really have nothing at all to do with Russia, it just reminds you of how insidious this narrative has really been. So just want to give you a quick update, and I will talk to you later.